for the Ideals Speaker Series. It's hosted by the Institute for Information Literacy at Purdue. I'm the director of the Institute, and Rachel Fundater is the associate director. And the Institute, and I'll talk a little bit about some of our work before we introduce our speakers. So the Institute was formed a few years ago. And really, the idea of it is to promote information literacy in the world, right? And we do it in a couple of ways. So we actually give out small seed grants to research teams to investigate information challenges, right? That sort of from an information literacy perspective. We have an undergraduate research program that Rachel and I run. It's a year-long program every year. This year, students are investigating, they look at an information challenge that's sort of something they can look at locally. And this year we're looking at how do people use, or how do students actually use information to have discussions around climate change. So right now they're doing the analysis, and it's very exciting. And of course, one of the key things that we do is the Ideals was a symposium the first 2 years. So we had these day-long events, but then we've switched it this year to a speaker series. And just to give you just say a little bit more about the seed grants. So we're in our second cycle of them. It's kind of coming to a close. In November in the speaker series, we heard from a couple of the research teams about their work. We paired the folks who were looking at healthcare. So, one of the projects was looking at how to alleviate information poverty in pregnant women in rural Iran. And the other one was looking at what is this perceived usefulness of AI in healthcare for women in South Asia. So those were really fascinating projects, right? And very much the kind of things that the Institute is interested in exploring. How can information literacy sort of help with these challenges happening in the world? And then, of course, the Ideal Speaker Series. And Ideal stands for Information and Democracy, Education, Access, Libraries, and Society. And so far, we've had, since last summer, 3 of them, and then we have one today. So we're trying to have an event about every couple of months, more or less, right? And of course, today the topic is medieval information literacy, which I'm very, very excited about. And of course, with our speakers today are Drew Whitworth from the University of Manchester and Kristin Leaman from Purdue. They're going to talk about sort of what we would have called perhaps information literacy in the medieval period, right? And how that enabled people to better navigate the information spaces, right, that they were working in at that time. Drew is from the University of Manchester, and his work examines information literacy from critical perspectives, and he's written and presented extensively on information literacy, including authoring 3 books on the topic. And Dr. Kristin Leaman she's a faculty member here in the libraries, as I said, at Purdue, and she's an expert in medieval manuscripts and book history, and she studies medieval and early modern dis and misinformation. Fascinating. And she's currently working on a book that's under contract with Brill that's called Printing Ælfric in Early Modern England, 1566 to 1687. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. First, Drew will present. They'll each present, and if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, but we're really going to, hold the question period until after both of them have spoken. I thought because their topics will be, related, it might sort of foster some ideas of questions we might want to ask them. But if you have questions along the way, pop them in the chat, and then we'll, funnel them to the speakers at the end. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides and turn it over to Drew.
Okay, hello everybody, or good afternoon from where I am. I'm Drew. I do not claim to be an expert medievalist. I have been working in the field of information literacy, I guess, for 22 or so years now, probably since I first encountered the notion. I did become interested a few years ago, though, in what we could find out about medieval information practices through studies of old texts. I've been particularly influenced by this esteemed personage who is Professor Michelle Brown. I mean, this is the kind of person who I would say seems to know everything about everything that ever happened in Europe, say at least from about the years of 750 AD to around 1450, an absolute mine of information. As well as I would add also the staff and of the MA we have here in medieval books and writing, I think it's called here at Manchester, and the John Rylands Library. I come at this topic as someone though who has developed a great interest in the discipline of information literacy and thinking about how and why we might benefit from attention to medieval information practices. What can we know about them in a general sense? I did get a paper published about this in the Journal of Documentation in, I think, 23. It might have been 2024 by the time it finally came out. But this presentation is essentially a summary of that paper. I will list several examples and sort of explain why I find them interesting and inspiring. Um, I did forget to start my stopwatch though, so you'd better tell me when I reach 20 minutes, Clarence. Okay. I guess the first time I encountered a text that really made me start to think about the practices of information users in the medieval era and what we could learn about them in the modern era was when, in the writing of my 2020 book, Mapping Information Landscapes, I went to Hereford, which is a small cathedral town in the, well, city, but small city in the southwest of England. And there is stored, and always has been stored and displayed, the Hereford Mappa Mundi, which is an extraordinary document, the largest surviving medieval world map. And this, could talk for 20 minutes just about that. But what you see there is India, and it's up at the top of the map because East is at the top. And yes, that's an elephant. Now, there weren't a lot of elephants in Hereford in 1300. There's probably still not a lot of elephants in Hereford now. And while it could be argued that the scribe in this case, and it is reckoned that three scribes worked on the Mappa Mundi, but that one of the scribes may just have been copying an image that was from another book. This is not the point. There's so much detail and a wealth of information on this map that it could not possibly have been created without several things being true. One is that the scribes who created it were positioned at a nexus of practice and information flows that they learned to exploit. And they learned to make judgments about the relevance of information, to gather data together into an information net and depict the world without the Americas, guys. Sorry, because they didn't know about the Americas, but Europe, Africa, and Asia depicted, in reasonable geographical accuracy and with a wealth of information of detail, including illustrations of biblical stories, but also, as you see with the elephant, and in Norway, there's a gentleman wearing skis, quite evidently on the map. So there's a lot of factual information on this incredible document that when you see it, you realize that, the manuscript, in this case, a map, but the manuscripts are not just text. There is a development over time of ways by which these texts could be navigated and made more useful. What you see here is a 9th century Gospels, the McDurnan Gospels, they're called. This is in Lambeth Palace Library in London. These are cross references. I don't know whether you get to see my arrow, but I'm kind of hovering it around here at the top one of those two boxes. Okay. So this must be the Gospel of John because these are cross references to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what this is basically is saying is that this part of the scripture, this whatever is being described here, can also be found in Matthew chapter 50, because that's an L, Roman numeral, Mark 41, and Luke 56, isn't it? Down here we have a separate reference to Matthew and Luke, but not to Mark in this case. So the Gospels are not all, the same. And it is argued that one of the great reasons why books, as opposed to scrolls, started to become popular is that scrolls don't really facilitate flipping back and forth, whereas books do. And if, as with Christianity, you have four essentially parallel versions of your Holy Scripture, the four Gospels, and you're a priest or a scholar wanting to, check your sources, having some kind of cross-reference was like pretty useful. And these are techniques that don't just emerge from nowhere, but they're invented by practitioners who share their insights. This is a canon table. This is a kind of collection of all these cross references, a very beautiful page that appears in a gospel that is held in Manchester, in fact, in the John Rylands Library, the Ottonian Gospel. And again, I'll come back to this image a bit later on, but when you see things like this and you start to realize that the notion that somehow information management and information literacy itself only starts to emerge in 1974 when Zukowski names it, I just thought it was a bit silly. What Zukowski, if you have read Zukowski, do read Zukowski, it is a good paper. But if you have read him, he talks about the transition from the reading services environment to the information services environment being essentially driven by digitization. But this reading services environment is not something that was only, invented in the 20th century. It has been developing arguably since the, libraries of Alexandria. Um, so, 100,000 or more years. The scholarly apparatus of technique, of practice, of means of dissemination of practice, and of being able to write something and put something like that in a manuscript and have it made intelligible, have this practice become intelligible by people who might be checking this manuscript 100 or 200 years later. This to me is evidence that perhaps it's not information literacy as we might recognize it in a modern digital workplace, but it's certainly signs of shared practice, the negotiation of what it means to be a competent user of information, and learning to use new media. Just this one final image, it's a bit trivial, but I love it. This is a book of hours. A book of hours is essentially a kind of cross between a medieval kind of diary and a prayer book in a way. And this is a calendar, and it basically says what you're supposed to do on each of these days. This is October, as you may just about be making out here. And the owner of this book of hours has written his birthday into the calendar because what this says here is on this day was born Richard, King of England, at Fotheringay in the year 1452. This book of hours was owned by Richard III, e.g., my horse, a kingdom for a horse, and all that. Found in his tent when he died at the bottom of Bosworth Field. But I love this. This is the King of England writing his birthday in his diary, as we might do now. When you see things like this, you realize how people, when they gained access to media from the highest born King of England all the way down, as we'll see in a minute, to through scholars and abbots and monks and scholars in the new universities, but down to more prosaic professions as well. People were learning to use the possibilities of these new media and communicating their understanding of this learning. A key shift in knowledge came when learning started to spread out from ecclesiastical and monastic settings into the universities. The first university as we kind of know it was Bologna in 1080 AD, I think, in Italy. Oxford kind of came along in about 1200-ish. I forget the exact date. As Illich says in this quote that I quite like and have given here, this was a moment at which he says, after centuries of Christian reading, the page was suddenly transformed from a score for pious mumblers to an optically organized text for logical thinkers. But that's a really interesting point because, yes, if you were learning in a monastery, you really just dealt with one text and or exegeses on that text, commentaries on that text, e.g. the Bible. But once the universities start getting going and knowledge is being rediscovered, the knowledge of classical Greek and Roman civilizations was being rediscovered. At this time, it's not just happening in Europe either. You've got the Arabs and the Hindus doing, civilizations doing some great things with mathematics and astronomy, and people were starting to learn from each other. And universities, you started to go to university not just to become a priest or a monk, but, to become a scholar or to become a lawyer or to become an educated person. And there became a need to access knowledge more quickly than would have been done with the traditional monastic settings. What you see on the left here is a table of contents. I mean, it's a simple thing that we take for granted now. But that is a table of contents that has been added to this manuscript some 200 years after the original manuscript was created. Not therefore by the original author, but by a scholar who came in, felt that the book needed something to become a more useful information resource, imposes his own structure or interpretation of the structure or the ordinatio, the organization of the knowledge within, but doesn't just, keep that as a bit of, paper that he stuffs in his pocket or loses under his mattress in his little cell, but writes it into the book, inserts it into the book, and it's there for scholars to use up until the present day. This is an anonymous practitioner working to communicate and disseminate an innovation of his, a guide, a piece of commentary on his view of what this book is useful for. What you see here is a sort of elaborate version of that in a sense. This is a gentleman called Peter of Lombard, invented what is called the intercism or intercut format. And you see here the large font effectively is the, scripture, words from the Bible, and this is all commentary on it. So it's a optically organized text, as Illich said in the quote I used earlier. This was an innovation that spread pretty quickly. By the way, within a few years, there was evidence of this being used elsewhere. And remember, information and knowledge can spread only as fast as a horse at this time in history, but it did spread reasonably quickly. It's interesting that some other innovations didn't. That's a pretty arbitrary image there, by the way. But alphabetization is an innovation that didn't spread particularly quickly. Someone had a go at it. I know I'm being shoddy with my citations here, and I could have prepared a bit better. But there was evidence that, at least in one particular manuscript from about the 1100s, somebody tried alphabetical order and introduced it with a guide to exactly what this newfangled thing called alphabetical order was. And then it didn't prove to be all that useful. People sort of said, well, why do we need alphabetical order when we've got natural order? Because things were organized naturally. If you think about it now, if you were to ask somebody what the first planet is, they'd say Mercury, I bet. They wouldn't, they'd have to think a moment before they would be able to answer what the first planet is alphabetically. What's the first planet alphabetically? It's the Earth. There you go. So you had to think about it, right? The medievalists were the same. They said, well, alphabetical order is just arbitrary. Why do we need it? So it went away again. It didn't take. It wasn't something that automatically, suddenly everybody was working with alphabetical order. But a couple of hundred years later, once the universities get going, people see the advantage of now, instead of having to learn a new classification system every time you enter a new field of knowledge, which of course we still do with things like the periodic table and so on. But nevertheless, the advantages became more apparent of having a system of organization that was universal and that could be applied to any field of knowledge and allow, again, a certain amount of just bringing together of things like indices and so on, which is, of course, why we use alphabetical order now. These are all just examples. Of course, none of this is happening in a virtual space of some kind or just in an abstract way. It's happening in particular practice settings. It's happening in libraries. Scriptoria were the places in monasteries where books and manuscripts were written. But the library is not just where they were stored, but it's where they were used, and where they were used in common with other readers, with other scholars. Common practices developed and were communicated, as books moved around, as scholars went from place to place. If you've ever seen the movie The Name of the Rose, I mean, I have no idea how accurate that is in reality, but it seems to be based on reasonably useful, scholarship by Umberto Eco, the original novelist. And there's some really interesting stuff in the book as well as the movie about, how knowledge was developed and spread in these times. And Parks here, a really good review book on all of this. There's a reading list at the end of these slides, by the way. Clarence, I will send you the slides so you can distribute them. Yeah, what Parks is saying here is apparatus that we take for granted, tables of contents, chapters, paragraphs, originated in the applications of these notions of ordinatio and compilatio by writers, scribes, and rubricators, blah, blah, blah. By the 14th century, the reader had come to expect some of these features, and if they had not been supplied, he would supply them himself on the pages of his working copy. Look, I'm actually going to skip this slide. I'm skipping the slide. Right. One more thing, one more example. When I discovered Hugh of St. Victor and the Didascalicon, I was convinced that I could be reading nothing else other than a medieval library skills textbook. Hugh of St. Victor was the abbot of St. Victor, which is near Paris, and his book, the Didascalicon, which was subtitled De Studio Legendi, or On the Study of Reading, became what we'd call now a bestseller. Loads of copies were made of this. And Hugh was offering the students of his abbey, but also of other learning settings, practical and intellectual orientation regarding what they should read and of the order, manner, and purpose that should govern their reading. This is from Taylor's introduction to Hugh. Hugh is offering, information in this book about how to categorize knowledge, how to make judgments of relevance, how to understand the provenance of books of the Bible, and how to use information techniques of the time. And going back to this canon table, I mean, when I first encountered something like that, I was looking at it going, well, I see the point, I guess, but I don't really understand it. Read Hugh. This book is written in 1150 or something like that. Part 4, Chapter 10 of the Didascalicon, of which one paragraph is reproduced here. Really good introduction, a specific guide to the use of this particular information technique that, frankly, I still found useful as a modern reader almost 1,000 years later. So Hugh's advice is not without value. And I love also, as an aside, his occasional sardonic comments about, what should a good student be? What's the mindset of a good student? But he's got some nice things to say about lazy students, including one contemptuous little paragraph there where he says he's contemptuous of those who seek to seem learned rather than to be so. Amen to that. I'm sure we know people like that today. He wasn't a snob, though, and he was certainly someone who recognized the value of learning, not just for scholars, but for society as a whole. He recognized that learning was a spiritual duty and something that the religious orders were helping to promote and raise humanity back to what we might call prelapsarian, classical standards after the Dark Ages. He definitely saw it as his learning duty, and he's very clear in the Didascalicon as well that scholars should not, shy away from any branch of knowledge, including, he says, more practical and mechanical arts, as he calls them, like agriculture and medicine, could be all, valuable to the task of raising humanity to higher levels of living and of learning. So I would say the Didascalicon is well worth a read. We must, we cannot ignore the idealism, or we cannot be too idealistic about the inclusiveness of these learning spaces. They were quite exclusionary. There was certainly an exclusion, although not a total one, but largely it was men doing the work rather than women, although there were some female scribes and scholars. Writing, though, was obviously a profession from which there was money and status to be gained. This is a contract. This is literally what you would call an indenture. You cut the contract in two, and each contractor has a half. And of course, if there's a dispute, they have to bring them together. And only if the cuts match exactly do they bring these two things together. Anyway, writing contracts, writing estate management books, the spread of writing outside of the learning settings into more prosaic everyday settings because it was seen to be useful. This was all an important part of the spread of literacy as a thing that people did. It's not just something that was happening in universities, but something that, people were using. Probably more people could read and write at a basic level than we might nowadays assume. But nevertheless, being able to write in a skilled way, being, that literate, if you like, was something that could get you money. So it wasn't, scribes were not idealistically teaching their skills to all and sundry. There were no, writing schools for the workers or whatever. So we do need to bear these things in mind. Right, I am nearly done, but I realize that all I've done today is give you a series of examples. But they do inspire and interest me, and I think there are things that we can say and that we should, develop a research agenda for investigating how, if information literacy is a trajectory, which I think it is, it's not just a moment in time, it's a development of practices from the past through to the present and into the future. These landscapes are palimpsests with many layers, and some of these layers are very, very old standing and obdurate. I do believe that in things like Hugh's work, we can still see the roots of what remains and if you ask me, could also sometimes be a bit of a damaging gap between the way that we conceive of information literacy in academic settings and the way that we conceive of it outside the academy in workplaces and communities, for example. And many authors have attempted to draw attention to this down the years, and I think we see the roots of this in scholarly practice of the medieval era. How these new practices emerge when technology changes and people have to learn to use different types of technology. Again, this is a validation, I think, of the ways that, as I've said here in this quote, information crosses between practice settings and new techniques are developed as these different groups approach this with different purposes and attitudes. We can see this, I believe, in practice. And from what I've seen of Kristin's presentation briefly, I'm sure that she's going to attend to some of these things. We have opportunities to study these manuscripts that are much more accessible than they used to be in the past. No longer do you necessarily have to travel, on horseback for a start to a monastery in Italy somewhere, but you can, digitize and view a lot of these manuscripts online. This lady, by the way, is Shelley Magellan, she's called, and she's digitizing here manuscripts from the East India Company as well, which is another example of old information practice. This one's from Manchester. The British Library have a lot of their manuscripts digitized, and I'm sure there are many resources in the States as well, as to which you will know more than I. I will say this, always, take the opportunity to provide a Monty Python reference. But if you remember, this is the scene in which Brian is being told off by the Roman, centurion John Cleese for his bad Latin. I have to say, my Latin is becoming a little better over the last few years, mensa, mensae, mensarum, and all that. But this is the main obstacle. It's not so much reading the script; it's understanding the Latin these days. And there are a lot of abbreviations in these old medieval manuscripts, and people like Professor Brown and the London Rare Books School, invaluable information that you just still have to be taught about how to interpret these texts in ways that are much the same as probably Hugh's students were 900 years ago. Many abbreviations that you've just got to remember. But I think it is a productive area of study, and one that, while my lack of general linguistic skills limits my interest to a Eurocentric perspective, there are many examples of information technologies from all around the world, and I only didn't have a decent image to include for like the Arab and Hindu world. This is Chanquillo in Peru, which is an astronomical observatory, thousands of years old, but an ICT nonetheless. I think there is a fascinating potential comparative study waiting to be done here. Right? How do the early information management structures and techniques of these different civilizations still influence the way that different cultures process information today? It would be a great study to be done, but I'm out of time. And just that picture, by the way, again, something from the London Rare Books School, but that is Mary and Jesus, the baby Jesus Christ, the infant Christ, but in a bed, because this book was written for rich people who, didn't want to see them in a scruffy old stable. They wanted to see them in a cozy bed with sheets. So, slightly over 22 minutes there. I know, clowns, but I am done.
No, but thank you very much, Drew. That was wonderful. And then we'll turn it over to Dr. Kristin Leaman for our second presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. I am going to present on medieval mis and disinformation today. And this is something that I've been working in for the last 2 or 3 years, and it is an understudied area in medieval studies in the way that I am examining it and dissecting it. I designed a course on medieval mis and disinformation a couple of years ago, and I'm in my second time of teaching it, but I really have just been working my way through this and learning as I go. And, peer review and presentations, it really helps me because I get such valuable feedback from medievalists, from information studies people, from psychology. It's such an interdisciplinary area. And so I am going to share with you. Let's see. Why is that not going forward? Okay, there we go. Just want to give a brief outline. I'm trying to get my little bar around here. There we go. So a brief outline. I am going to briefly define and discuss disinformation and misinformation and the history of the terms in the English language. And then I will give a brief description of critical disinformation studies and the framework that comes with that. There are several ways of dissecting critical disinformation studies. I want to acknowledge some appropriation concerns and presentism concerns when engaging in this type of work. And I have found it very helpful when I am trying to organize my brain that there is disinformation during the Middle Ages, and then there's disinformation about the Middle Ages. And in doing that, I have kind of figured out how to organize my classes and my brain and my research. And then I have a bibliography. I have so much information on this that I can't fit in my bibliography here. So if you are interested in information, I'm happy to share it with you. So, moving into disinformation and misinformation, something I've noticed, and I think we all notice, is that they're sometimes used interchangeably or applied correctly. Fake news is also something that gets put into the mix. There's certainly an important distinction, though. And I find that particularly when there is discussion in medieval studies about mis and disinformation, these terms can be applied loosely sometimes. So disinformation is inaccurate, misleading, and designed to deceive, but it's also designed and presented and promoted to intentionally cause public harm for profit. Misinformation is inaccurate and misleading, but it can be disseminated by an individual who may not be aiming to deceive or cause harm. They might actually believe the information and think that they're being helpful by sharing it. But misinformation can still cause a great deal of harm. In the Oxford English Dictionary, we see that the first use of misinformation in the English language is 1587. It's an older term. And the first use of disinformation is in 1955, which is closely tied to Soviet history. And so what we run into here is just this understanding that misinformation is easier to apply and use because you don't have to prove ill intent. So if you're not sure, and particularly in looking at the Middle Ages, if you're not sure somebody's intent or their heart, misinformation is the more appropriate term. All right, so moving on to critical disinformation studies. There is an excellent article written by Kuo and Marwick. It's in my bibliography. And critical disinformation studies highlights the problematic nature of how information, knowledge, and history are often produced by social and political actors and used to legitimize and validate social inequality. Viewing disinformation through this lens of power and knowledge production illuminates how knowledge is used to justify racial divisions and structural inequality, both historical and in the present. And I take that a step further by saying it also demonstrates how marginalized communities are disproportionately harmed by disinformation, whether it is in the 21st century or the pre-modern world. And when I say pre-modern world, I mean pre-1800. So the disinformation framework here that Kuo and Marwick identify is in four principles. So we have the first one that is grounding disinformation studies in history, society, culture, and politics, centering analyses of how social differentiation such as race, gender, and class shape dynamics of disinformation, foregrounding questions of how institutional power and economic, social, cultural, and technological structures shape disinformation, and stating and maintaining explicit commitments to justice and equality. So something that I think is very important um, when discussing taking a framework from the 21st century and applying it into a pre-modern world and a medieval world is understanding what the intention is, what the argument is of the people who are creating the framework. So Marwick and Quill write, by taking a historical and contextual view of disinformation, we argue that both the content and the framing of disinformation reproduce whiteness in the United States. Clearly, they are talking about the US with this framework, and they're talking about the 21st century in particular. And so I am very thoughtful when I'm using these frameworks to make sure I'm not appropriating someone's framework to use in the past to potentially advance attention to problematic texts. So by exposing the position of book history and medieval studies, I studied the very historically rooted systems of power that privilege white perspectives, examined by Quill and Marwick. So I state this, but I still practice it. It's always a work in progress, that it's important not to appropriate the argument against its own ends to advance attention in problematic texts, particularly in my book project, when I'm looking at early modern Protestant texts. I'm being very mindful of this. So moving forward to presentism, I want to acknowledge this as well. And engaging in disinformation work in the Middle Ages or pre-modern world, uh, you have to address presentism, that, it's an interpretation of history that is biased towards and colored by present day concerns, preoccupations, and values. And so Armitage argues that the range of possible presentisms includes some that are compatible with writing good history and even conducive to human flourishing. And I do believe that disinformation studies can do this. So I acknowledge that the terms misinformation and disinformation and fact-checking would not have been known or used by individuals during the Middle Ages or the pre-modern world. However, this certainly doesn't mean that disinformation and misinformation were not present, or that people were not engaging in mis and disinformation during the Middle Ages, much like we see today. So by taking a critical lens to medieval mis and disinformation, centers the victims of these information attacks while also holding accountable the powerful players and institutions involved in creating and disseminating the information. So those are a few things that I wanted to take care of before jumping into some examples. So mis and disinformation during the Middle Ages, there's historical texts. You'll see one that I will outline shortly. There's forgeries such as land charters, where sometimes scribes would forge the documents in order to maybe extend land out a little further than what it was. And then literature and fiction, and this is a tricky area. So it takes a different approach with fiction, and I'm working through this right now with actually a tale from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and it's a work in progress. But if anyone has thoughts on this or questions about disinformation in medieval fiction, I think that I'd love to hear from you. So, as a case study, I want to walk through the Malleus Maleficarum. It's translated to Hammer of Witches, printed in 1486. And there's the title page. So that we can get on the same page, because I know we're all coming from interdisciplinary backgrounds. Some background on the Malleus. It's a demonology text, so it's a treatise on witchcraft, first printed in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer in Germany. Kramer believes in witchcraft. He believes that there are witches doing bad things. They need to be hunted, they need to be found, they need to be tortured in order to get admission. And so this is a very shortened version of a more complicated and very dark text. Kramer was a Dominican friar, an inquisitor. He attempted to prosecute women for witchcraft in 1484 in Innsbruck, Germany, but he was actually chased out of the city on belief he was insane. However, on December 5th, 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issues a papal bull regarding witchcraft, and that empowers Kramer to create and disseminate Malleus and launch an inquisition on witchcraft. 36 editions were printed between 1486 and 1689, which is an average of a new edition every 5 years. That's an immense amount of labor and just in looking at book history and like the economics of book history, that's a lot. And that's also signaling to us that printers also believe they could make money off of this as well by printing these texts. The text is heavily focused on women. And for any of my friends in the audience who are not medieval Latin readers, Christopher McKay's translation is excellent. So when we look at grounding disinformation studies in history, society, culture, and politics, so we take these principles that Quo and Marwick have laid out, this framework, and we can see that we have 15th century Germany. We're in the early beginnings of the Protestant Reformation. It is a largely agricultural society, and the invention of the printing press in Western Europe was well on its way in 1450. When we start to center analyses of how social differentiation, such as race and gender and class, shape dynamics of disinformation, we need to ask questions such as who is the target of Kramer's information attack? And we know that it was illiterate, lower socioeconomic women. And in the way that he writes the Malleus, he also just states anyone who believes that sorcery and witchcraft don't exist, you're in trouble too. So there's not a lot of space for people to be disagreeing with this text at this point. And because of Kramer's position, it's a difficult thing for people to combat. So what Kramer has in mind, and McKay states something so important, is the sort of sorcery that he believed to be practiced among uneducated peasant women, which is overtly distinguished from educated magic practiced by men. So, in what ways can victims of this information attack successfully fight back? Well, they can't without putting themselves at extreme risk. And so, this is that imbalance of looking at the victims of an attack and the structures and the individuals and their connections and how they have been able to disseminate this information in a harmful way. Another idea that Cole Marwick outlined is fact checking, and that telling somebody they need to fact check is victim blaming. And so the idea that we would tell individuals who are victims of a disinformation attack that, well, they were ridiculous for believing it, or they should have been fact checking, or it puts the onus on the wrong person when really we need to be looking at the individuals and the institutions responsible for disseminating false information. Again, fact checking, that's not something anyone would have known about in the Middle Ages, but it's still important to bring into this conversation. Okay, and then we talk about foregrounding questions of how institutional power and economic, social, cultural, and technological structures shape disinformation. So let's take Kramer's background. He's educated, he's connected, he's a member of the clergy, and he was simply chased out of Innsbruck and not imprisoned. And when you consider when they chased him out, if this had been a woman from a lower socioeconomic bracket, that probably would have ended very differently for her. So things to keep in mind there. The papal bull issued by Pope Innocent VIII emboldens Kramer. There's an approbation from the faculty at the University of Cologne, so there's direct validation of Malleus from one of the most prestigious theological faculties in Germany. So our institutional power there. Kramer had access to a printing press. He was geographically and socially connected for access, and something that I've seen scholars bring up, and it's true, it's very important. If Malleus had been written in manuscript before the printing press, would the German witch trials have happened on the same scale? Thousands and thousands of people were murdered in the European witch trials, and the printing press being able to disseminate that information quickly uh, definitely empowered people to do that. And as one of my students said, it was a perfect storm of events that allowed Kramer to create and widely disseminate his information attack. Okay, there we go. So it's always really important not to look at text in a vacuum in book history and medieval studies and anything that we're doing with information. It should never be in a vacuum. And so looking forward, in 1584, Reginald Scot publishes his Discourse of Witchcraft, where he says it doesn't exist, witches don't exist. It's actually unchristian to believe in witches. And moreover, you shouldn't be torturing people who can't defend themselves. And so, in a nutshell, Scott is fighting back against the disinformation by using the same structures, by using the printing press and by using his own privileges to try to correct this. But King James doesn't like this, and so his response to Reginald Scot in 1603 is to write a demonology that says, actually, no, it is Christian to believe in witches. It says it in the Bible, and he goes through this whole argument about that this is real and that witches need to be sought out, found, punished, dealt with. And there is a focus on women in his text as well, of course. And so, in looking at that, when we see that the king is saying this, and that also this has gone through several iterations. Now we're in England. Now we're moving into the early modern period. So it shifts geographically over time. All right, so disinformation and misinformation about the Middle Ages. There's misrepresentation of images, there's misappropriation, weaponized medievalism, and conspiracy theories. One thing I won't talk about here, but the Voynich manuscript is the scholarship around that. There are some really interesting conspiracy theories around the Voynich manuscript. Lisa Fagan Davis is the person who studies the Voynich manuscript. She's a wonderful resource. And I actually had her come talk to my class about the many emails and conspiracy theories that she hears from people. All right. So an example of getting an image confused is the image of the Omnibanum circa 1365, wrongfully described as the plague in the 20th century, when really it is leprosy. An excellent article by Jones and Neville outlined this case study. It's a 14th century Latin encyclopedia. In 1996, an art historian studying the manuscript identified the image as a depiction of clerics with leprosy receiving instruction from a bishop. This took off, and in 2006, errors spanned from the British Library's Images Online webpage to Wikipedia to commercial stock photo websites. And interestingly, after a request to correct the image description to the host of 51 websites, only 22 website hosts made changes. So we talk about this in terms of, in my class especially, when people are presented with correct information or truth, and how they react to it is also very interesting, and that it doesn't always end in the result you might think if you're like, well, no, here, now we've corrected the information. Another area, and I'm close to wrapping up here, As QAnon promoter and influencer, Jacob Anthony Chansley is described as a pseudo-celebrity at alt-right rallies, flashing his tattoos, including three prominent Norse symbols, Thor's hammer, the walnut, and the world tree. And so this is a understanding of misappropriation of symbols, medieval symbols. And our responsibility as medievalists, and this is a quote by Richard Fahey at the University of Notre Dame. In today's world, by far the most important reason for medievalists to know the trends in popular medievalism and engage with this media directly is white nationalism. As scholars of the period, we must be aware of information, misinformation, and disinformation that is being widely disseminated if we are to have any hope of using our voices to help debunk, nuance, and contextualize shows like Vikings and The Last Kingdom with a watchful eye toward white supremacist interpretations and appropriations. And for Quo and Marwick's last principles stating and maintaining explicit commitments to justice and equality, I state that by teaching ourselves and our students to engage with this important work of medieval studies in the classroom, at a conference, or with a publication, we are working toward honoring this commitment to justice and equality. And I have a bibliography here if anybody is interested. I'm happy to share my slides. And then, of course, what's a presentation without a doggo in the margins playing a hurdy-gurdy? Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Kristin. Well, let's thank our speakers, and I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. And there's a question in the chat actually that it says for Kristin. It's from Michael Johnson, but I think either of you might, have something to say about it. But how do you account for changes in what society understands as the grounds for truth, right? So obviously they had a different sense of truth, or maybe different things were true to them, right?
An interesting question, isn't it? I did see Michael's question come up while Kristin was talking, and I was thinking about it. I mean, Hugh is quite keen to. Hugh exhorts that it seems to me that there's no particular universal grounds for truth, but that truth is something that you investigate through scholarly practice. On the other hand, there's certainly some passages in Hugh's Didascalicon where he's quite clear that, I mean, this book should appear in the Bible because it's proven, and the Apocrypha, as he would call it, these books are not proven. They shouldn't be part of the canon. And I'd have to go back to the text to check, but in that particular occasion, he does seem to be saying, well, just, this is true because it's in the Bible, and this is true because it's not in the Bible, or this is not true because it's not in the Bible. So I think there's a bit of both going on, but it is an interesting question. I mean, I wish I could answer it myself. I don't know if Kristin has an opinion.
Yeah, Mike, you bring up a really good point, and it is something that I grapple with a lot in this work, and I try to be really careful about. And so, yeah, the truth would have been different to them. And so, Kramer's a perfect example of this. Is that you notice I didn't say he was disseminating disinformation because he very well likely believed everything that he was writing. That was his truth, and so I think that we can look at it and dissect it in terms of understanding how misinformation was working at that time and how it was impacting people who may not have had the power to stand up. And it continues throughout history and geography where we see when people are being oppressed and we can see the same theme happening. But yeah, you're absolutely right that that's the tricky part of this work, and you have to be so mindful of it. And I always rely on my my colleagues to hold me accountable for it.
Yeah, let's see. So Zoe has a hand raised. So maybe you could have the last question.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for such incredible talks. I have a question for Dr. Whitworth. So I am an art historian developing my dissertation on readers' marks and doodles in scholastic manuscripts. And I was really entranced by your talk, and I was wondering if I could apply this similar kind of information literacy to an art historical analysis of readers' marks through drawings.
I would say yes. Um, I mean, have a look at Professor Brown, who I do credit with a lot of my knowledge of this area, but certainly in the reading list. By the way, I didn't seem able to share my slides in the chat. I will send them to Clarence though, if he can distribute them. Okay.
Yes, I will.
There's a book there where Brown and some of her colleagues very much they are writing about the visual aspects of all of this. I mean, not everybody could read, but you could still make use of the information in the books because of symbolism, color, design, and notes, noti they're called. Um, there's all sorts of visual and graphic devices, and I know that there's a quote from Brown's book where she definitely says, visual literacy is very much a part of what is, the whole configuration of literacy skills that were used to interpret these texts and but by different levels of society. If you couldn't read all of the Latin, you could still get something from the pictures, and this is why the Mappa Mundi is so cool as well. So I don't know if that helps answer your question, but I certainly think I would have a look at Brown's stuff if you can get hold of it.
Thank you so
All right.
much.
Sure. Okay. Well, I'd just like everyone to one more time thank our amazing speakers, Kristin and Drew. Thank you so much. This was a great event. I learned so much. So we will, I'd like to thank everyone for attending and say that we will have more of these speaker series. So please, be on the lookout for the announcement of the next thing that we do. And again, thank you guys so much, and everyone have a
The
great,
invite, Clarence, and enjoy the rest of your days, everybody.
yeah. And it's your evening, right? Or coming on the
It's 4 o'clock. I mean, I
fourth.
might, crank it up for another hours of work or so, but on the other hand, maybe not. We'll see. Okay, bye bye, everybody. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. Please feel free to email me if I didn't get to your questions.
And we will send out the slides.
I'll send them to you now, Clarence.
Okay, good.
Okay, bye bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.